Up to this point in the unit, we treated water as a substance and seawater as a chemical system. Today we focus on interactions. The ocean does not exist in isolation. It is constantly absorbing heat from the sun, exchanging gases with the atmosphere, and responding to winds generated by atmospheric circulation. Understanding this boundary is essential before we can talk about tides, waves, or currents. Air-sea interaction refers to all the processes by which the ocean and atmosphere exchange energy, gases, and motion. This interaction happens at a very thin boundary, the ocean's surface, but its consequences extend throughout the ocean and the atmosphere. The fundamental driver of both atmospheric and oceanic motion is uneven solar heating. Earth receives energy from the sun, but that energy is not distributed evenly across the planet's surface. The reason for this is geometric. Earth is spherical. Near the equator, sunlight strikes the surface at a high angle. The same amount of solar energy is concentrated into a relatively small area, leading to strong heating. As you move toward the poles, sunlight strikes at lower and lower angles. The energy is spread over a larger surface area and must pass through more of the atmosphere before reaching the ground, and this reduces the intensity. The two illustrations on the left side of the slide demonstrates that light hitting perpendicular to an object is more concentrated into a smaller area than the light that hits at an angle. This is exactly what happens at the Earth's surface due to the curvature of the planet. Light energy is more concentrated as it travels through the air and hits the surface at the equator, whereas it is less concentrated as it travels through the air near the poles. The energy is scattered across a larger area, so air near the poles heat up much more slowly than air at the equator. Please pause the video here to make sure you understand these illustrations and this concept before we move on. This latitudinal difference in heating creates a global energy imbalance. The tropics consistently receive more energy than they lose, while the poles lose more energy than they receive. Earth's atmosphere and oceans act together to redistribute this excess energy. In short, warm air will move to displace cooler air. Without this redistribution, temperature differences between the equator and the poles would be far, far more extreme than we observe now. This uneven heating is the root cause of atmospheric circulation. Everything we discuss next, pressure differences, winds, and large-scale circulation patterns, originates from this basic imbalance in solar energy. This concept is essential to understand before moving forward. Please pause the video if needed. To understand air-sea interaction, we must treat the atmosphere as a physical system and not just the air around us. The atmosphere is a fluid. Just like water, it has mass, it occupies space, and responds to forces. Because air has mass, it exerts pressure on Earth's surface. Atmospheric pressure is simply the weight of the air above a given point. Density is a critical property of air, and density is strongly influenced by temperature. When air warms up, its molecules gain kinetic energy and begins to move faster. As a result, they spread further apart, and that decreases the density of the air. Cold air, in contrast, has slower moving molecules packed more closely together, making it more dense than hot air. These density differences have important consequences. Less dense air tends to rise, while denser air tends to sink. Vertical motion in the atmosphere, rising warm air and sinking cold air, is a direct consequence of temperature-driven density differences. This vertical motion sets up pressure gradients at the surface, which then drive horizontal air movement. Understanding these physical properties is essential because they explain why air moves at all. Winds are not random. They are predictable outcome of density and pressure differences caused by uneven heating. Uneven heating of Earth's surface leads directly to pressure differences in the atmosphere. When air warms and rises, it removes mass from the air column above the surface, creating a region of lower surface pressure. Where air cools and sinks, it adds mass to the air column, creating a higher surface pressure. Air naturally moves from regions of high pressure toward regions of low pressure. You can see this demonstrated in the very middle of this illustration, where cooler air from the high pressure point is moving toward the low pressure point. This movement occurs because the atmosphere is constantly attempting to redistribute mass and energy to reach equilibrium. The horizontal movement of air-driven pressure differences is what we call wind. The cycle of surface air moving from high pressure to low pressure and warm air rising up to the upper atmosphere as it cools creates a convection cell that creates almost constant movement of air in the atmosphere. It is important to stress here that wind does not exist independently of pressure. There is no such thing as wind without a cause. Every wind pattern reflects an underlying pressure gradient, which itself reflects temperature differences created by uneven solar heating. Once wind forms, it becomes a powerful agent of interaction with the ocean. Winds transfer momentum to the ocean's surface, enhance evaporation, and increase gas exchange. Although we will discuss ocean currents later, it is important to recognize here that atmospheric circulation provides the initial forcing that links solar energy to ocean motion. Up to this point, we've been building the logic of atmospheric motion step by step. We started with uneven solar heating and then discussed how temperature affects air density, and then showed how pressure differences generate wind. What we haven't yet done is put all of that together into a global picture, and that's exactly what this diagram does and what the point of this slide is. Because Earth is heated unevenly, warm air constantly rises near the equator where solar energy is most intense. When that air rises, it does not simply disappear, it's got to move somewhere. So as that air rises, it spreads toward the poles at high altitude. As it moves away from the equator, it begins to cool and become denser. And that will cause it to eventually sink back toward the surface. This rising and sinking motion creates a large-scale circulation loop known as the Hadley cell, which you can see in both of these diagrams. The Hadley cell is not a special case. It is a consequence of physics. Warm air rises, cold air sinks, and the atmosphere organizes itself into circulation cells that transport heat away from the equator. Similar logic explains the Ferrel cell at mid-latitudes and the polar cells near the poles. That's where cold, dense air sinks and moves back toward the equator near the surface. What matters most for us is not memorizing the names of these cells, but understanding what they do. Each circulation cell creates predictable regions of rising air and sinking air. Rising air tends to be associated with low surface pressure, while sinking air produces higher surface pressure. These pressure belts are stable over long timescales because the uneven heating that drives them is always present. Now connect this back to slide 4. We said that wind is air moving from high pressure to low pressure. If that is true, and it is, then these pressure belts must generate persistent wind and wind patterns. And that is exactly what we see. Air flowing from the high pressure regions associated with sinking air does not move straight toward low pressure. Because Earth is rotating, that moving air is actually deflected by the Coriolis effect. The result is the trade winds in the tropics and the westerlies at the mid-latitudes. These are not random winds. They are the surface expression of global atmospheric circulation driven by uneven heating. This diagram is important because it shows you that wind patterns are not isolated phenomena. They are embedded within a larger circulation system that redistributes energy across the planet. These wind belts are persistent, predictable, and powerful. And they are the primary way that atmosphere communicates motion and energy to the ocean. With this global picture in mind, we're now ready to look at one more important factor that influences how air moves. It also influences how water moves as well. We will now take a close look at the Coriolis effect. It is a product of Earth's rotation and helps explain the circulation cells we just talked about, wind patterns, climate, and marine ecosystems would look very different if not for the Coriolis effect. It is yet another critical concept to understand from this lecture. To understand the Coriolis effect, we need to start with Earth's rotation. Earth rotates from west to east, completing one rotation every 24 hours. That's what we refer to as a day length. Importantly, different parts of Earth's surface move at different linear speeds. Points near the equator travel faster than points closer to the poles because they have a greater distance to cover during each rotation. Notice on the right side of this figure that New Orleans and the Galapagos Islands sit along the same longitudinal line. As Earth rotates through the course of 24 hours, the Galapagos Islands is actually traveling a larger distance to return back to the same point in a 24-hour period, which of course is one complete rotation of Earth. New Orleans has a shorter distance as it is sitting near 30 degrees north of the equator and clearly within the curvature of the Earth's shape. So New Orleans has a shorter distance to return to the same location in 24 hours. Therefore, it travels slower. I recognize this concept can be challenging to imagine and picture in your head, and sometimes it can actually be quite mind-blowing to think about at times. So take your time with it and pause the video for a second if you need to, so that you can fully understand what this illustration is showing. Now imagine a parcel of air that begins moving northward from the equator toward high latitudes. When that air starts moving, it carries with it the eastward rotational speed of the equator. As it moves north, it enters regions of Earth that are rotating eastward more slowly. This air does not instantly lose its original eastward momentum, so relative to the surface below, it moves ahead, appearing to deflect to the right. This apparent deflection is what we call the Coriolis effect. It is not a force pushing the air sideways. It is simply the result of conserving momentum on a rotating planet. In the northern hemisphere, this leads to deflection to the right of the direction of motion, and in the southern hemisphere, the geometry is reversed and deflection is to the left. The Coriolis effect is zero at the equator and increases with latitude, which is why large-scale atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns only fully develop away from the equator. And that's something that we'll talk about a couple lectures from now. So now let's put all of this together with the Coriolis effect. Global wind patterns emerge from the combination of that uneven solar heating as well as the Coriolis effect. Near the equator, intense solar heating causes warm air to rise, creating a region of low surface pressure. That rising air eventually cools, spreads outward, and sinks at higher latitudes, creating regions of higher pressure. Air naturally moves from high pressure regions toward low pressure regions, but because Earth rotates, those moving air masses are deflected by the Coriolis effect. The result is not straight north-south flow, but curved wind paths that organize into persistent belts. The trade winds, as you can see on these illustrations, the trade winds form as air moves toward the equator and is deflected westward. The westerlies form at mid-latitudes where air moving poleward or toward the poles is deflected eastward. These patterns are stable over long time scales because the energy imbalance that creates them, that uneven solar heating, it's always present. These wind belts matter enormously for the ocean because they apply consistent stress to the ocean's surface, shaping evaporation, gas exchange, and eventually surface circulation. We will return to these wind patterns later in the unit when we talk about surface currents. Heat crosses the air-sea boundary through several mechanisms, but two are especially important: sensible heat transfer and latent heat transfer. Sensible heat transfer occurs when there is a temperature difference between the ocean surface and the air above it. Heat flows from warmer to cooler material until equilibrium is approached. Latent heat transfer involves phase changes, particularly evaporation. When water evaporates, it absorbs energy to break hydrogen bonds. That energy is stored in water vapor and carried into the atmosphere. That energy came from the water, and therefore evaporation causes the remaining liquid to cool just slightly. This is generally the same concept as sweating. Our body sweats when we get hot. As the sweat absorbs heat and evaporates, it cools the body. When the water vapor later condenses back to liquid water in the upper atmosphere, the energy is then released. Likewise, liquid water freezes to ice. It releases a small amount of latent energy to the remaining liquid. This process only works because of water's high heat of vaporization, a property you learned about earlier. Latent heat transfer in the form of evaporation is one of the primary ways the ocean redistributes energy into the atmosphere. And of course, that is a significant part of the water cycle that you may have learned about in other classes. Gas exchange occurs because gases tend to move from regions of high concentration to regions of lower concentration. At the ocean's surface, this means gases move between air and water depending on their relative concentrations. Now, temperature strongly influences this process. Cold water holds more dissolved gases than warm water because gas molecules move more slowly and are more easily retained in solution. Wind enhances gas exchange by increasing turbulence at the surface, exposing more water to the atmosphere. These mechanisms explain why dissolved gas concentrations vary spatially and temporally across the ocean, even without invoking circulation. Air-sea interaction controls temperature, gas availability, and chemical conditions in the ocean. Temperature affects metabolic rates and species distributions. Gas exchange controls oxygen availability and carbon chemistry. Heat storage and release influence seasonal and long-term stability of marine habitats. Marine ecosystems are therefore shaped not just by conditions within the ocean, but by ongoing exchanges with the atmosphere. Understanding these mechanisms is essential before moving on to physical ocean motions such as waves and currents and tides. Please review parts of this lecture as needed to understand the concepts introduced in this lecture. They're going to be critically important as we will come back to them later in the unit. In the next lecture, we will continue discussing the interaction of air and sea, but within a different context. Next time, we're going to focus on waves and learn how waves form as an interaction of the atmosphere and the sea.